So my talk is entitled The Patient of the Future. And what I would like to share with you here are my thoughts on where care will go in the next few years, because I strongly believe that it is actually driven by a different type of patient than we used to see. Patients today are better informed than ever before and are more demanding than ever before. And I believe that this will put a pressure on a system that actually is willing to evolve because it has seen the necessity that with the limited resources and an aging population, we will have to change if we want to live up to our ambition of best care for all. Now, the subtitle is a European Patient Advocacy Perspective, and just very recently I had a couple of meetings where people wanted to meet me, and then when we met, they said, actually, to be honest, I just wanted to meet you because I wanted to know what a patient advocate looks like. So I thought I'm going to start with some thoughts what patient advocacy is, how someone, and Joanne already alluded to that, with a medical background and a PhD in molecular biology, who was actually had always dreamt of becoming a pediatric surgeon and then got stuck and was very happy in a molecular lab looking at the modularity of gene regulation, ended up becoming a patient advocate. Then I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the concept of patients and patient advocates and how we best capture the knowledge that sits in these people. And then I would like to end with a few examples, because theory is nice, but I thought I'd just share with you what we've been doing in the last few years. Now, you don't grow up dreaming of becoming a patient advocate. And as was already mentioned, I lost my husband to cutaneous, so not ocular, but cutaneous melanoma in 2012. He was diagnosed in 2011, and that was just at the beginning of the new era of new medicines. And unfortunately for us, it was too late. This picture, well, I live in Sweden. I'm German by origin, but I live in Sweden. This is the lake behind the house, and this is my husband rowing a boat after 1 month on targeted therapy. And this picture to me means a lot, because when he started that therapy, he wasn't able to use his right arm anymore because the tumor had grown so fast. It was like, when it was found, it was metastatic already, and he had already lost the use of his arm. He couldn't dress himself anymore, he couldn't cut his own food, and he had struggled working. He really worked as a database administrator. So this is 1 month on an innovative therapy that for us was like a miracle. What I had always appreciated about surgery was the immediacy of the action. If you're a gifted surgeon, you operate and your patient goes home and is better. That is what I liked about it. And these medicines were very much like that. It was also medicine where we got to hear, oh, we don't know, and it's uncertainty and the risk associated with it. So a lot of time, and that was already alluded to, I spent actually looking at clinical research, protocols, designs, questions of how to approve drugs and how to make them accessible. That is driven by that personal experience, but not the purpose of this talk, but just to give you a bit of context. So it is the very personal motivation that got me into patient advocacy. Now, a bit of context for those of you who are not familiar with cutaneous melanoma. Cutaneous melanoma, when I went to medical school, and that was, well, I was born in 76, so that was a bit later than we had just heard prior, so I started my education years later, but nothing had changed in the endless time before. Melanoma of the skin never responded to chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and that was unfortunately still the case when my husband was diagnosed. However, it was 4 years that were totally changing the game. We have now 11 approved therapies, 8 mono, 3 combinations, with a few more coming through now, that have now turned a disease that had a 15% overall survival at 2 years to data that was presented at AACR recently, close to 70% for a subgroup at 3 years. So you can imagine the progress and also the hope and the desperation to have access to these new therapies. So it has been an exciting time where innovation directly impacted the lives of people, and you can actually watch innovation change the fate of people. So it is with great pleasure, and it's also with awe, to be sitting in this. How is this possible that no one ever calls me until now? I don't have a wristwatch, so I have to need this for my time. To stand in this amazing place where even the architecture things voyage, outlook. It's even called the center of the unknown. And that, in a way, very nicely summarizes what I've been doing for the last 4 years. I started founding a patient network, and I never planned of running a patient organization. And so we're not one, we're a network. And we're a bit unique in that. And we have been exploring ways to work together, to educate, to learn, to change the setting we live in, that I would like to share with you in the next half hour or so. A lot of this is exploratory, is something we've never done, that no one has ever done. So it has been a steep learning curve for us. And I would say that I've probably never learned more in my life than in the last 4 years. Now, patient groups, this is what most people think of when they hear patient group. They think people sit together in a room and tell each other stories how bad things are. While peer-to-peer support is an important factor, and we've heard this, Bettina just mentioned it, that you here get together to meet like-minded people, to exchange, to talk, to have a coffee together. That is true for every condition. If your life has been affected by something as serious as cancer with an enforced prognosis, this is what you're looking for, people who understand your life. So peer-to-peer support is important, but not really what we're doing. Now, we live in the EU, still of the 28. The EU is, for those, because we know we have an international audience there, we have 24 official languages, 5 semi-official ones, plus 60 minority languages. So language barriers are an enormous challenge for anything you want to do in Europe. Now, because of my training, because of medical background, and because I was working at university, I could access research papers when my husband was diagnosed, and I could read them, understand them, and we took treatment decisions based on that information. And it always struck me as unjust that I was able to do it while others weren't. You see, when I had to choose what I wanted to study at university, I was, thinking either medicine or chemistry. And in the end, I opted for medicine for a number of reasons. But I could equally well have opted for chemistry, and I wouldn't have been able to read these papers. So it is not even just the level of your education. It is like something as a choice you make when you're 18, 19, that then later on determines your chances to survive. And that struck me as unjust. Add to that only a third of European adults are actually able to read as much as an English newspaper. Everyone here is aware of the difference between a medical publication and a newspaper. So when my husband was already diagnosed, we were very active on patient forums, worldwide patient forums, and I early started explaining the content of research papers, findings, publications, trial designs, and I kind of grew into that, and the difference it made to people understanding the disease and being able to act upon the latest medical information was enormous. And this is still and remains a cornerstone of what we're doing. We educate people to the highest level we can possibly think of. So we attend, just very much like anyone, we attend conferences like ASCO or ESMO, which are of relevance to cutaneous melanoma, and we are the ones with the green lanyards there. So we are covering these meetings by blogs, so we have several people sitting in the room writing while the speaker is talking in different languages, so we are able actually to translate something or share something across Europe very, very fast. How is that possible? Now, we build a network, and I want you to think of Europe as different circles of, let's say, defined by language barriers. And what we do is, the blue points in there are people who speak English, and the thing we're doing is connecting them. Sounds easier than it is. This is actually based on network theory, and my background in molecular biology was quite handy. We worked in genetic networks because it turns out that social networks share a lot of properties with genetic networks. If you look at the structure of a network, a single patient will be a node, a single point. Then you have people who connect, which we call hubs, and then you have higher order connections. When I was going through the presentation for today, I actually realized that I should talk to someone who does data visualization, because what we're actually doing in this network is we're shortening the length between people. So if you want to see the tightness of contact represented in the length of the arrows, you would have to pull these blue dots together. And what we have by now is a very tight-knit, European-based group of patient advocates who are often patients with advanced melanoma. Now, I just squared one of the pink bubbles. I could have squared any. This does not only operate by language or by country, but also by interests. So we have groups that are specific for For example, a group of ocular melanoma. So we have a sub-network for patients with ocular melanoma. 3 of my colleagues are actually sitting here, some of them with these green lanyards. We also have now started a group for pediatric melanoma, another rare form of melanoma. We have groups for stage 3 melanoma, for stage 4 melanoma, people who have lost someone to melanoma. And you have to think of that. That is not something that we sit there and decide. It's something that grows organically. If there is a need, people will split off and form their own forum. And it has a life of its own, and I've been struggling to find a metaphor for it, because you have to think of these networks. I call it a multidimensional network system, like a living organism. That is something that evolves and that you have to take care of. And I put these little dots in the middle. These are the core ones. These are people who are extremely well connected and drive across, and that would be a person like myself and actually my colleagues here. We are the ones who drive action across Europe, and you're going to see some of our projects later on. I couldn't find a good biological analogy, so if you take an anorganic example, think of a crystallization experiment. I'm sure you've done this at school, where you just take a simple salt solution, but you need to provide an anchorage where all of a sudden beautiful crystals will form. And I think of a network working like this. You have to provide the right environment, and what crystallizes then can be extremely beautiful and powerful, as hard as a crystal becomes that comes out of a solution, if you think about it. So I'm still working on a metaphor, but just like to give you an impression what a system like this looks like. So if you just think there's just social media out there or just a Facebook group, these platforms are way more powerful than just a group. Now, to go back, because, and that I must admit is totally in my own interest, because patient involvement has become one of the buzzwords of the day. And it is one of these classic cases where what you get out of the process is what you put in. And I, for starters, have by now put in quite some thought, what I believe is crucial and important in order to make this process successful and constructive for everyone involved, and not just a feel-good exercise for anyone. If you think about a patient, and on the right you find a definition that is an evolution of a first draft that I drafted for the Patient Advocacy Working Group at ESMO, the European Society for Medical Oncology. A patient is someone who's concerned about themselves. They are out for help and care for themselves, and a carer like I was would be then out just for one single person. The moment your focus shifts from yourself to the group of people in the same condition as yourself, you become an advocate. So it is the difference in focus and perspective that makes a difference between a simple patient and a patient advocate. Now, I have a medical background and a molecular biology background, so what I will be able to comment, for example, on a research project will be something very different than someone with a legal background. So don't come to me with a legal problem, because I'd be just the wrong person. Ask my colleague who has been sitting at university for years and has maybe a sub-degree in international relations. So there is a value of the combination of technical knowledge and experiential knowledge. And if you just put this on a quadrant like here, and I don't have a pointer now, if you start with a patient is concerned about themselves without any technical knowledge, you can have that. There are a few people out of there who combine high technical knowledge with their personal experience. They're often called patient experts. What these people, and now we move to the right side of the graph, miss is the experience and the diversity of the group, what a patient advocate will have. And then there you have the one in the red on the bottom, is someone who combines technical expertise with the perspective of the group. And why does that matter? So our resources, like everyone's, are extremely limited. We are a network of purely volunteers. None of us is paid. We all have other jobs. We do this in our free time, believe it or not. So we think about, and a lot about, we think a lot about impact. Where do we put our effort and time for maximum input or impact for our people? This network that I just described to you is a loose network, and we operate according to the principle of subsidiarity. So we do not tell people what to do. You all know very well, at least when you live in Europe, that health is under national authority. How our healthcare systems differ considerably. So if a problem arises, it will arise locally and it will have to be addressed locally. And in my opinion, I'm a European citizen. I strongly believe that it is the local citizens who have the right to demand these problems to be addressed. And this is not something you can or even should be considered doing from the outside. So where we put our resources is driven by the impact that we want to make on a local level. So I've plotted this on a diagram. On the left, you see the possible impact and reach. And then you have the different patient populations. And I think that the two factors I mentioned earlier on, namely your technical level of expertise and your ability to capture diversity in a group, are crucially important and limiting eventually to the impact and reach that you can have with your activities. Now, if you take me, myself, and I, how representative am I? Probably not at all. So if I just stand there and say, this is what melanoma patients want, do I even have the right to do that? I don't think so. So I will present you, I'll show you later on some work we've done, how to get our heads around like the diversity within a group and getting what I call the granularity right. I could have put on the right side where I put understanding diversity and granularity of a group, I could have put representativeness. However, that term is kind of tricky because most people understand representativeness in the sense of elected. However, you could elect me as much as you wanted, and I would be still no more representative for the group I'm speaking of. So what I mean with that is the ability to capture diversity and granularity in a group. Now, if you see a simple patient on the left bottom, this is someone without any specific training, and this could be training in anything about the disease, but also how to access treatment, how to understand, for example, how they have to follow surveillance schemes. We've heard just about the Chinese example earlier on today, and there it is surely for cost reasons, but I'm sure there will also be a part of patients who simply do not understand the need or the importance of continuous follow-up. And losing these people, we lose them because of lack of education. So a patient like this has very limited reach. They can't influence the system around them. If you start educating a patient going to the right, this patient is already much better taking care of him or herself, because this is someone who will have understood that going to the surveillance or to follow up exams is important. So you increase the protection for that single person. If you are then able, and I have examples for that, what we call expert patients, the potential of these people rises. And then we have the ones on the top who can actually argue, for example, with authorities, because they have a deep understanding of what the group needs. Now, because this is abstract, I thought I put some examples on them. So for me, as I started and as I told you, my primary drive was to make important information accessible for everyone in need. Knowledge protects, this is what we call it in our network. We put a lot of emphasis on education, and that happens daily on our forums. So we teach on our forums. We have very strict rules what you can post. If you make claims about therapies, these have to be supported by evidence. So if someone says this therapy is the new best thing, we will ask immediately, and where did you find this? We try to be not too harsh, because if then someone says, I've read this in the Daily Mirror, then of course that's not a reliable source of medical information. But if you're too negative about it, the only thing that you do is you push people away. Exactly the same happens when you tell your patients not to Google. That's exactly the same, because of course, what are they going to do? They're still going to Google, because we use Google for anything, from buying theater tickets to plane tickets to finding, I don't know, public transport in Lisbon. And the last thing I Googled was actually, I read about the Tower of Belém, which is just here, opposite, not far from here. So instead of telling them not to Google, tell them what to Google for. And you have already contributed largely to their education, because a lot of time what happens is that people do not know what to search for. That then obviously limits what they find. And I think that's a simple first step to improve education of everyone. Now, a very, I think I was too fast now. This is from our own experience, and this is a recent book title that has been published by Eric Topol, who is actually a quite interesting person to, if you're on Twitter, to follow him on Twitter or on LinkedIn. He publishes quite widely and has an interesting blog, so what's coming out is quite insightful, I find. What we have seen from our own experience is that patients who are well informed and understand their disease are more proactive in their care. they will reach out to their medical team earlier. They will report side effects earlier. And they will have a different type of discussion with their oncologist about their care. We, at the beginning, obviously had quite a bit of backlash when I started educating people because, well, I've always, looking back at my life, I have probably always had a penchant for education. So I wasn't very fast to get my driving license, and I had to pay for it myself. So I taught a lot of mathematics in order to pay for my driving license. I went then to university, and to finance my studies, I taught anatomy, and so it moved on. So looking back, I've been teaching actually for most of my life. So that's just what I started more as an instinct, probably. But our oncologists first weren't very impressed. However, it turned out that these patients had a much better connection to their oncologist, that the discussions about useless therapies that these people had found in the newspaper, green tea, asparagus, cannabis oil, you name it, reduced. So we have by now enormous support from our community, and I think it helps everyone. The connections and the relationships have improved, and I think this is something for every one of us to work on. What happens to an informed patient is also that they regain some of the control over their lives. When you are dealt with a diagnosis, and that happened to us as well, like malignant melanoma, we were just settling in Sweden. My PhD was a horrendous experience, and life was just getting good, and we were actually planning to have a third child. And we went from that to preparing for my husband's death within one phone call. And that requires an adaptation, which is enormous and brutal. And that hits everyone, independent of your background. And you feel your life has totally spun out of control, and you have nothing to say what happens to you anymore. Knowledge and being able to make decisions gives you back some of that control, and that's what allows you then to prepare for the next step and sleep at night. So even though it is never easy, patients who know and understand the disease deal better and cope better with it. And apart from that, and I think this entire process has been greatly helped by the internet, because it has never been easier to find information, and high quality information, free of charge. So you can read up on what's going on at major conferences, listen to videos, they're fantastic educational resources. If you go on the Nature website, what Nature produces is astonishing, and you can learn and educate yourself about nearly any biological and medical process you're interested in. So I do believe that this is something, as you can tell, close to my heart. Now, there is then this, how do we lift patients from just knowing more about for themselves to an expert patient? And there's some interesting cases I would like to, and I call this Better Care for Less. To give you two examples what I mean about this. On the left side, this is a young woman suffering from diabetes type 1 who has what she calls created an artificial pancreas system. So she has an IT background, and what they basically did is that they hacked the electronics of their devices and are now able to constantly measure and control for the blood sugar level. All of this is open source, so if you have the technical background, they actually teach others how to do this to basically improve their health outcomes by better monitoring their blood sugar levels. She is speaking about open innovation and patient-driven innovation, and this was from an article where she commented on whether they should be regulated, and if, how, and why. And it is a very interesting movement. I think this is typical for chronic diseases where people have the time to adjust to conditions. So for cancer, that's probably less appropriate. But I think this is a very interesting example to follow on. I could have put another one. It's a Swedish woman living with early onset Parkinson. Her name is Sarah Rigere. She is studying herself. She also has an IT background. She's carefully monitoring herself and tracking how she can improve her treatment and what other supportive measures allow her to even regain some of her mobility. So it is people like that who challenge our assumptions, what a patient is and what can be done, and they definitely are able to improve their own lives by that. But that's why the line's under the Better Care for Less. While these people are driven by better care for themselves, there's also the motivation by healthcare systems, and this is an example from the UK, where they see value in these expert patients in helping to provide better care at a lower cost. So this is an initiative from Nesta, and it's called Realizing the Value. They are trying to leverage this knowledge that exists in patients for the greater benefit of the group. It's a quite interesting project, and they make the case, for example, for payers to support these type of initiatives because there is a certain return on investment in them. So there is also this financial component in there. And even while on the left side, these patients are in there for their own care, also they are driven by financial incentives, and their decision to make it open source that anyone could access is part of it, because they were asked to patent it and they refused. So there is definitely also something important that we should consider if we think about sustainability of our healthcare systems. Now, the last bit that I mentioned already before is these were the two examples before were people who were driven by the desire to improve their own care. But there's this additional perspective or the additional value you can add by being able to capture diversity in a group. And this is now an example of our from our own network. This is a pilot project we did together with the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and it was driven by a discussion about what is risky and what is beneficial and whose perspective should be decisive in the end. It came, as I earlier alluded to, we saw these early effects, these melanoma. There were 2 new classes of therapies, and we were lucky that these therapies showed effect very, very early on, unlike many other therapies in other cancers where improvement is rather gradual. And we, of course, every patient wanted to have access on it, while the system was rather like, oh, we don't know these products. And it's like, well, the other option is certain death. How bad can it be? So it came out of this discussion. What is risk? What is benefit? How do we assess it? And who gets to make the trade-offs? That we started this project. It was, together with a research group, it was a multi-criteria decision analysis, and basically people were asked how many high-grade toxicity, how many low-grade toxicity they were willing to accept in order for an extension of their lives. Now, this was done together with another patient network, and they're called Myeloma Patients Europe. And we, unfortunately, people tend to mix this up, though myeloma and melanoma have nothing to do with each other, but because we're so similar in name and we're also quite similar in approach, we did this project together, but please, one is a blood cancer, one is a solid tumor with different prognosis, different age groups, very different. And that's the reason why I say that we should have never done this figure, because this is basically plotting all preferences in this study in one graph. I do believe the value of this figure is to show that there is no such thing as the patient opinion, or that's what patients want. There is always a natural spread. And I think the interest in there is understanding whether preferences are rather clustering and narrow, or whether there's a wide range of possible options. Because in the end, we don't want to provide care to the average patient. We should aim for providing care that is appropriate to the person sitting in front of us, just very much as we would like to receive appropriate care and adequate care that does what we need and want when we are the patient. So this is just to highlight there's natural spread and preferences. Now, I'm sorry, they're not so intuitive. On the left side is basically just plotted what I told you earlier on, moderate severity, higher severity versus what would you accept in order to survive? What it means is if you look in every gray box to the right, the third box to the right, the higher it is, it means the more risk you're willing to accept in order to survive. This is hardly surprising. Patients on the left, regulators on the right, because the nice bit about this study was that we had a control group of regulators working at the EMA. So the outcome was patients are willing to accept more risk than regulators, and that's hardly surprising for anyone who's ever had contact with regulators. Now, this is not exciting. However, what is rather exciting, and this is even messier, we had a feeling that it was not appropriate to lump together everyone at our conference. So what we actually did is we specifically took stage 4 patients, because there the risk of losing your life is obviously highest. We took carers of stage 4 patients, and we took advocates who take care of stage 4 patients, but who are neither patient or carer themselves, and that turns out to be important. On the left, you see the patients, in the middle, the carers. On the right, you see the advocates. The red line, the red dotted line, is the reference line from the regulators. Now, it turns out that all of a sudden, our patients are way more willing to accept risk. Our carers are more in line with what regulators think, and then it turns out that our own advocates were more risk averse than even the regulators. Now, something like this, these numbers are too small, so that's why we should be following up on this. And I've been saying this for some time, but because our drugs were so efficacious, they moved fastly and swiftly through regulatory approval. So we tried to be focused on what kills our people, and that's not killing our people, so we don't invest time there. But what this meant is, depending on whether you ask a patient, a carer, an advocate, you will get a very different reply. So if you want true input, if you're really serious about helping patients, ask the patient themselves. Don't take a proxy, because you will be very far off if you're unlucky. Why is that important? Patient is often too sick to travel or to invest time. The carer is busy with the patient, so who's free? Well, someone who's not a carer or a patient. But beware. Now, this was actually interesting because the motivation behind that was that the regulators actually said if they were able to identify a way to identify with certainty different groups within an apparently homogeneous patient population, they would consider this for approval or relevant for approval and make group-specific approvals. I don't think we're there yet, but there's definitely the willingness. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. Now, and now to what we do as advocates, what I care about and what I passionately believe is that the combination of technical knowledge together with the experience and understanding of a group allows us to change the system for everyone and for the better of everyone. Because not everyone ends up on our forums. Not every patient wants to know in detail what's going on. Some people simply don't find us because they can't Google, or they have just no interest. And that is fair too. It's probably my medical background, but I think just from a human perspective, we should aim to provide good care for everyone, independent of what that person decides or provides. And I believe that this perspective, that people who understand the system and can combine it with their own experience, is extremely valuable to teach everyone. Because if there's one awakening, is that I thought with my background I had understood what medicine was about. When it hit us, I realized how little I had understood. And this is the same story that tells you that you get to hear from every single person. Does that mean I understand every disease? Of course not. I even don't get every cancer. So if you want to hear about breast cancer, ask a breast cancer patient, don't ask me. Even if you want to hear something about how it is to live with advanced melanoma, I would send you to a patient because, especially after our own data, I'm dubious that I fully get what matters to a patient. And I would have loved to believe that I knew what my husband wanted, but I have proven myself wrong in that context. So for me, or what we do in our network, is how can we lift advocates to a level that they're able to deliver or constructively contribute to processes that shape healthcare system for the benefit of all. This is just an example, and this is actually something that we feel quite passionate about. This is about access to medicines. You will remember that I showed you the little diagram, the 4 years that changed the future of melanoma. Unfortunately, access to these innovative therapies was uneven and delayed across Europe. So in some places, we all of a sudden saw people live, and just a few kilometers westwards or eastwards, people continue to die. By someone who has seen what death of melanoma looks like, and as a firm European, I consider this unacceptable. So I'm German by origin. I studied in France. I spent my 4th and last year of university in France, and then did a PhD in the UK, and I moved to Sweden because I got an interesting job offer there. In that situation, it doesn't make sense if we're able to coordinate our educational structures and make it easy for us to move between countries. How is it that we differ so much in healthcare? Why should the country you happen to live in define whether you live or die? And that in such a tight, confined space as Europe, that's something I'm not willing to accept. And nor are patients. Our forums are full of desperate patients trying to access these innovative therapies. And for that reason, we have become heavily involved in constructs, how to make innovation accessible. And one of the steps towards that was that we actually looked at those 11 approved therapies and where they are in terms of being stuck, if you want, in a given healthcare system. So we did this as a parallel exercise over a weekend. So every group of patients or patient advocates focused on their own country, and in collaboration with the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Science, a center that has produced maps of how a medicine gets approved and made accessible through every country. People went product by product in their own country and looked where the product was stuck. Was it accessible? Was it approved? Was it undergoing health technology assessment? Was it reimbursed? If not, where is the issue? And what is the committee or the factor that is holding it back? We did this in parallel, and if you are structured enough, and you can all do this online, so this was done on multiple Google Excel sheets, and you can be quite sophisticated about that. All these tools are available for free. You can generate a very detailed, granular view of what's going on in a couple of, I think we had 12 countries there, in one weekend. And this is what networks can deliver on limited resources, and that ticks any box. Financial resources, people, time. And that is a power that I think no other configuration can do in such a shape. But we are able to do that. And that was the first off, that was a pilot. We have been collaborating with a lean startup accelerator. So if you have a startup company, there are special accelerators or programs that help startups to get up to speed and not fail by avoiding known mistakes that startups apparently tend to make. But they have a very helpful thinking that was beneficial for us. So we invited these people to share their experiences and learn from their way of thinking. And what was quite appealing there was that, and I think that's a mistake that many of us do all the time, was that we fall in love with our ideas. And I think as a researcher, I definitely know that. So we think it's our idea, so it must be great, right? And having this space between your idea and the neutrality to evaluate whether it's actually doing what's supposed to do is crucially important, because it defines the speed with which you can drop that idea that was never any good, admit that to yourself, and get better. And if you look at lean thinking, that's exactly what they do. They have formalized the process, how to do that. And we've copied that. So because we had at the beginning many people who arrived, had these great, fantastic ideas, and then they tried to design it into the last little bit, and it took ages and a lot of money and never made any progress. So we have established a culture by now where people just give it a try. It can be rough enough, but if it works, we can refine and build on it. And that has allowed us to move ahead with, I think, incredible speed, because all this, and this is just a small part of what we're doing, has been work of less than the last 4 years, actually. Now, what came out when we did this in a couple of countries, and this is then the summarizing slide before I'm coming to the end, is if you have a new innovative product, if we want to realize innovation, and I'm quite brutal about this because we hear this a lot from anyone who produces especially expensive new therapies, they always talk about innovation. I always call a product that's just sitting there on a shelf is an invention. That's not innovation. Innovation is if that product is in a patient and delivers an outcome that changes society, that makes a difference, that's innovation. So innovation has this access component, a medicine that reaches the people in need. And we've heard this in the first session today in Brazil and in China, how difficult it is to get the appropriate treatment to the people who need it. That is successful innovation. So what we have mapped is the products and looked what happened between an approval, that would be on your left, that's the EMA approval, so EMA recommendation, European Commission approval, when a product can be sold in the European Union. That doesn't mean it's in the patient. And then we went through the steps. And then the final point is the drug in the patient, if you want. Now, what we have seen, and to summarize, is if you live in the eastern part of Europe or in the less finest healthcare systems of Europe, your problem is going to be likely to be on the left. So it's a quite high upstream problem where certain bodies in the country will hold back an innovative product, waiting for, as someone told me, and I thought it was cynical, but he was right, price erosion. So waiting for the price to come down, and then we'll decide on it. So this is what happens on the left side. If you live in the wealthier parts, usually western parts of Europe, your problem is rather going to be on the right. And it is easy to think, well, the drug is reimbursed, everyone has it. That's unfortunately not true. Even in the richest places in Europe, we see that patients are not treated according to guidelines because a local oncologist, and also that was alluded to earlier on about ophthalmologists who treat however, these cowboys exist everywhere. And they put patients in danger. So that very much is defined by the structure of your healthcare systems, but we have seen, for example, Germany is a decentralized healthcare system. We have seen patients, stage 4 patients last year treated with chemotherapy first line, melanoma, in a country that has everything available and accessible. So if you live in one of these countries, implementation of guidelines, centralization of care, control of oncology treatment plans is very much your part of the problem. And this is how we try to work. We try to help across Europe. As I said, we have a subsidiarity principle in place that helps everyone to move the needle forward in their own place, because one solution will unfortunately not fit for all of us here. So it is about how to work on solution in parallel in as many places as possible, and hopefully have a better outcome for patients. And before I conclude, I would, because of course this is a conference that is focusing on ophthalmology and the oncology of the eye. And we have been very fortunate to have a subgroup of patients among us. And it started yet again based out of a need, because we had ocular melanoma patients joining our networks in different places, and we were just simply not able to adequately help them. And we have been fortunate to work together with Cure, and there we know, like by now, quite a group of researchers and oncologists in this room. And that, I think, has been extremely impactful in terms of accessing treatment. As soon as you're in a rare condition, collaboration networks become even more important. They're always important, but in such a setting, they become incredibly important. I think we have been fortunate in this setup to be able to create a structure that unfortunately doesn't cover every part of Europe yet, but we are way better equipped to direct people who just end up in our net somewhere into places or towards places of excellence in care, and hopefully also improve the outcome for a melanoma subtype that unfortunately cannot be as successfully treated as cutaneous melanoma. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I hope it gave you at least an impression of what is possible today. And I deliberately showed you some of the work that we have already been done, because it is very easy to see problems and say, oh, this is never going to happen. But this is work that has been in the past, and we're just beginning. So this is a very apt place to stand in the center of the unknown. We don't know how far we can push it and how far we can take it. But we should never forget, they are in our healthcare systems, the largest group are patients. It's not physicians, it's not other healthcare professionals. The largest underutilized resource of our healthcare systems are patients. So let's see what we can do in the unknown, and to leverage the power of this largest group in our systems, and to a better future for all. And thanks again.